The engines roared as the Boeing 737 lifted off the runway, its nose piercing the thick veil of clouds above. Inside the cockpit, Captain Mark Reynolds and First Officer Julia Carter monitored their instruments with precision, unaware of the chilling events that would soon unfold. "Climbing to flight level 300, Reynolds said, his voice calm and practiced. Julia nodded and adjusted the heading. Outside, an unsettling darkness stretched across the sky, the moon hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. In the passenger cabin, travelers settled into their seats, some dozing off, while others watched in-flight entertainment. Among them, investigative journalist Ethan Moore thumbed through his notes, researching a string of mysterious disappearances linked to this flight route. He had boarded hoping to uncover a story. What he found would be far beyond his comprehension. Suddenly, the cabin lights flickered. A low hum resonated through the aircraft, sending an uneasy shiver down Ethan's spine. He glanced out of the window, but the darkness beyond revealed nothing. Back in the cockpit, Julia frowned at the sudden warning light flashing on the control panel. "Mark, we've got an issue with the CAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System. It's showing another aircraft in our immediate vicinity." "That can't be right," Mark muttered, scanning the radar. "Air traffic control didn't report any conflicting traffic." "Confirm with them." Julia keyed the mic. "Tower, this is Flight 184, we're showing unidentified traffic at our altitude. Can you confirm?" Static filled the channel, followed by a distorted voice. "Negative, Flight 184. No traffic in your vicinity. Maintain course." Mark exchanged a wary glance with Julia. Before they could respond, turbulence rocked the plane violently. A collective gasp swept through the cabin as Ethan's pen tumbled from his grasp, skittering down the aisle. A sudden jolt sent overhead compartments flying open, and the oxygen masks deployed without warning. "Brace for impact!" Mark shouted into the intercom, his hands gripping the yoke tightly. But there was no impact. No deafening crash, no sudden jolt, only an eerie stillness that stretched unnaturally through the cabin. Instead, a chilling silence engulfed the aircraft. The turbulence ceased, and everything seemed wrong. Ethan peered outside again, his breath hitching in his throat. Another plane, an Airbus A320, appeared out of nowhere, flying parallel to them. Its windows were dark, and its fuselage bore the unmistakable signs of decay: peeling paint, rusted metal, and something else, faces pressed against the windows, hollow and lifeless. Julia's voice cracked with fear. "Mark, what is that?" Before Mark could respond, the Airbus vanished into thin air. The cabin erupted into panicked whispers, passengers clutching their seats. Lisa, a flight attendant, tried to maintain order but was visibly shaken. "Please stay calm, everyone. We're investigating the situation." Ethan grabbed his camera, documenting the unsettling stillness that gripped the cabin. He turned to Lisa. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No, but I've heard the stories. Some flights don't make it back. They just disappear." Suddenly, the control panel came alive with a piercing warning chime. "Traffic! Traffic!" the automated system blared. But there was nothing ahead, nothing visible. Mark and Julia struggled to maintain altitude as an invisible force seemed to pull them off course. Ethan gritted his teeth, his pulse racing. The answers he sought were within reach, but at what cost? As the plane veered wildly, a distorted voice echoed through the cockpit speakers. "Turn back, before it's too late." And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the night swallowed them whole. The oppressive darkness outside the aircraft remained unbroken, swallowing any trace of the world below. Inside the cabin, the uneasy hush stretched on, punctuated only by the occasional nervous whisper and the low drone of the engines. Ethan clutched his camera, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed the eerie footage he had captured moments earlier. "This can't be real," he whispered to himself. Claire, seated next to him, leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, what did you see?" "That other plane, it looked ancient. Like it didn't belong here." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the cabin. "I don't know what's going on, but something's very wrong." In the cockpit, Mark and Julia frantically scan the instruments, trying to make sense of the data flashing before them. The cast still showed an unidentified aircraft dangerously close, yet their visuals saw nothing but the endless black outside. "Flight 184 to tower, we're experiencing multiple system anomalies and possible traffic conflict. Requesting immediate guidance," Julia said, her voice steady despite the rising fear. The response came through, crackling and fragmented. "Negative. Flight, you are alone in your airspace. Maintain course." Mark gritted his teeth. "That's impossible. I saw it with my own eyes." Before Julia could respond, the cabin lights flickered again, and a strange static charge filled the air, sending an unsettling tingle across their skin. The eerie hum that Ethan had noticed earlier grew louder, reverberating through the aircraft like a warning. Then, without warning, the plane banked sharply to the left. A chorus of screams erupted as the overhead compartments burst open, sending luggage tumbling into the aisles and adding to the chaos. Mark wrestled with the controls, his knuckles white. "It's not responding!" he shouted. "Something's pulling us off course." Meanwhile, in the cabin, Lisa tried to calm the terrified passengers, her own fear evident in the way her voice trembled. "Everyone, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We're experiencing unexpected turbulence." Ethan focused his camera on the window, his breath catching in his throat. In the distance, barely visible through the murky clouds, the ghostly outline of the Airbus A320 reappeared. Its decayed fuselage shimmered faintly, and through the darkened windows, lifeless eyes stared back at him. "It's back," he muttered, lowering the camera slowly. "We're not alone," Claire gasped, gripping his arm tightly. "Ethan, look!" A shadowy figure moved through the cabin, barely perceptible, slipping between rows of seats. Whispers that didn't belong to the living echoed faintly, sending chills down their spines. "I don't think we ever were," Ethan replied, his voice hollow. In the cockpit, Julia's voice cracked through the intercom. "Brace for impact. We're losing altitude." The plane's nose dipped sharply, and panic erupted throughout the cabin. Passengers clung to their seats, their screams swallowed by the deafening roar of the engines. Outside, the ghostly aircraft drew closer, as if it were pulling them into its haunting embrace. And then, as if the night itself had swallowed them whole, darkness consumed everything. The plane lurched violently, and the cabin was bathed in an eerie red glow as emergency lights flickered. Passengers clung to their seats, their faces pale and eyes darting anxiously around the cabin, frozen by an overwhelming sense of dread. The haunting hum that had plagued the flight now pulsated through the fuselage, intensifying by the moment. In the cockpit, Mark and Julia fought to regain control, their hands gripping the controls with white-knuckled intensity. "Altitude's dropping too fast!" Mark yelled over the cacophony of alarms blaring through the flight deck. "Something's pulling us down! I don't understand what's happening. The instruments aren't responding." Julia's voice trembled with panic. The ghostly Airbus A320 hovered alongside them, its skeletal structure visible through the turbulence and storm clouds. Its engines, long since lifeless, emitted an unnatural glow, and shadowy figures moved within its darkened windows. In the cabin, Ethan braced himself against the seat, his camera rolling. "Claire, what do we do? This isn't just turbulence, this is something else." Claire gripped his arm tightly, her voice barely a whisper. "We shouldn't be here. This place, it's not meant for us." Lisa's voice wavered as she moved down the aisle, urging passengers to remain seated. Though her fear was evident, determination glimmered in her eyes. "Everyone, stay seated. We're going to get through this." Suddenly, a chilling gust of wind swept through the cabin, carrying with it faint, disembodied whispers that sent shivers down their spines. The overhead compartments rattled violently as the plane's nose dipped further. Ethan turned his camera toward the aisle and gasped. A spectral figure emerged from the shadows, its hollow eyes locked onto him. "Oh my God, it's here!" he whispered in terror. Claire clutched the armrest, trembling. "Ethan, we have to do something." That thing isn't going to let us go. In the cockpit, Julia's hands shook as she desperately tried to switch to manual control. Mark, it's like we're trapped in some kind of limbo. Mark's jaw tightened. Then we fight our way out. Brace for another attempt at regaining altitude. As the plane trembled violently, a guttural, otherworldly growl reverberated through the cabin, making everyone freeze. Passengers sobbed quietly, their fear reaching a breaking point. Without warning, the ghostly Airbus banked sharply, cutting in front of them. A blinding flash engulfed the cockpit, forcing Mark and Julia to shield their eyes. What the hell was that? Mark shouted. When the light subsided, the phantom plane was gone. The instruments flickered back to life, and the plane leveled off, stabilizing. Julia exhaled shakily. Did we lose it? In the cabin, Ethan and Claire exchanged uneasy glances. No, Claire whispered, her eyes filled with dread. It's not over. It never was. The plane continued its flight, but the haunting presence lingered, unseen but deeply felt. Shadows stretched ominously, and flickers of light revealed glimpses of an impending darkness that loomed ever closer. The air inside the cabin hung heavy, thick with tension and the lingering echoes of what they had just witnessed. Passengers sat in eerie silence, their eyes darting to the windows, hesitant to glance outside but unable to fight the urge. The ghostly Airbus A320 was gone, but its presence still clung to their minds like a nightmare refusing to fade. In the cockpit, Mark and Julia stared at the now stable instruments, their hands trembling. It's like it was never here, Julia murmured, running a hand through her hair. But we know it was. Mark nodded, his grip on the controls still firm. We need to report this, if we make it back. Suddenly, a deep, resonant voice crackled through the radio, sending chills down their spines. Flight 184. You have crossed the threshold, you cannot escape. The voice echoed throughout the cabin, sending a wave of panic through the passengers. Lisa moved swiftly down the aisle, offering soothing words and reassuring smiles to the anxious passengers. Stay calm. We're safe now. Ethan tightened his hold on his camera, whispering to Claire. Did you hear that? It's not over. We're still trapped in this, whatever this is. Claire's face was pale, her fingers clutching the relic she had been holding onto since the beginning of the flight. It's the plane, she whispered. It's alive in some way. And it doesn't want us to leave. As if in response, the cabin lights dimmed, flickering erratically. The hum returned, low and insistent, vibrating through the walls and into their bones. The floor beneath them shuddered, and a cold breeze whispered through the aisles, bringing a faint, musty odor of decay. Mark! The instruments are fluctuating again! Julia cried out as the altitude gauge spiraled wildly. Mark swallowed hard, his voice strained. We have to push through. Full throttle, now. The engines roared louder, and the plane began climbing steadily. The oppressive force that had held them down seemed to resist, as if trying to drag them back into the darkness. In the cabin, the spectral whispers returned, growing louder, more insistent. Shadows flickered at the edges of the passengers' vision, figures that shouldn't be there. Lisa gasped, pointing to the far end of the aisle where a ghostly figure stood, its lifeless eyes fixated on them. It's still here! She screamed, backing away. Claire, gripping the relic tightly, stepped forward. This is the key, she said. We have to let it go. Ethan shook his head. You can't be serious. What if? Before he could finish, the plane jolted violently, and Claire made her decision. She rushed to the emergency exit, holding the relic aloft. With a final, desperate cry, she hurled it into the night. The moment it left her hands, the whispers ceased. The oppressive force released them, and the plane surged upward, finally breaking free of the dark storm clouds. The cabin fell into stunned silence. The lights flickered back to normal, and the eerie hum was gone. Mark exhaled sharply. We're back in normal airspace. Julia sat back in her seat, staring at the clear skies ahead. I can't believe it, we made it. In the cabin, Ethan lowered his camera, his hands shaking. But at what cost? Claire sank into her seat, exhausted. She stared out the window, her mind replaying every eerie moment, the whispers still echoing in her head. Some things should never be found, she murmured, a deep sadness in her voice, as if she already knew that they had disturbed something that would never truly leave them. The plane continued its flight, and though the ghostly Airbus was no longer visible, they all knew it was still out there, waiting, watching, and forever lurking in the darkness beyond the clouds.